Pleasant Sunday evening to everybody. Welcome in to the TDN Fantasy Top 200 Player Reveal Show. Chris Schubert, Jaime Eisner here with you. Jamie, we're going through all 200 of your ranked players here throughout the course of the evening. We got special guests joining us. Zach Cohen's going to be here later to break down some of the players on your list that he wants to talk about that bothered him. So he'll be joining us later on in the show. But we are here. We're going to go through all 200 players. I have to ask, you put together all the projections for this. You put together all the rankings for this. Where are you at here as we do this reveal? Are you nervous that we're releasing this to the world so that you can be judged harshly in front of a big crowd? Or how are you feeling here?
I'm feeling good. Look, here's the way I always look at this scenario. I put in a lot of hours to get these projections up and then to get these players ranked and all of that. I don't do that just to keep it all in silence or behind lock and key. I think that'd be a little bit weird. Mm-hmm. Part of the enjoyment of doing all this is being able to share it with everybody and being able to hear some of the scrutiny. Now, there will be certain players that we discussed today that I know full well I'm going to get pushback on, and I'm okay with it. But there are also some players that fantasy managers cause me to rethink. Like they'll hear these rankings, they'll discuss something with me, they'll send me a message, they'll lay out their argument. Maybe even Zach Cohen might convince me on something today as he lays out the argument on some of his players that he's cherry picked from my top 200. And then I go back and make adjustments. You know, I don't pretend that I have this infallible ability to predict the future. Like that's what we're doing. We're predicting the future. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be wrong way more than I'm right. But I would like to say that I base this on statistics, facts, trends, a coaching staff trends, player trends, career rates, all of that, all of those things. So I like to think we're getting as close as we possibly can in the scenario, given, you know, we can't truly adequately predict the future accurately. So, but I'm interested. I like to get this out there. I like to see the pushback, and there are going to be some names we spend some time on that I know people are not going to like. They're going to be mad at me about, right. And I'm okay with it. They're not going to change. We'll get into that later in the show. And then there will some that I will not like or I'll be too high on. And then people will come back and I'll give it a second look or a third look and I will tweak my rankings, tweak something. Maybe I missed something. We've talked about this on the TDN Fantasy podcast for those that are loyal listeners of that. If you're not, I highly suggest you go check it out.
Very good plug. Very good.
There was a difference between who's calling plays in Chicago that had to affect where my rankings and projections were, that didn't take the fact that Matt Nagy was taking back play calling into account. So these things are going to happen. They're going to be a little bit fluid as we get deeper into training camp and we see position battles and there are injuries and guys signing places, maybe some other minor trades that happen. But at this stage, I'm comfortable where I have everybody, but I'm excited to kind of reveal it to the world.
All right, you've done a very nice job filibustering there long enough. We need to start this train because there are 200 names that I am going to have to read here throughout the evening. And listen, I'm on a time crunch. The producers are in my ear telling me to keep it moving here. So let's waste no more time. Let's get it started. We're doing these in chunks of 20, and then there are players that Jamie and I want to discuss here on the show, mainly players that I want to argue with Jamie about and ask Jamie to explain himself to all of you. So let's get started here. Players 200 through 181, the first group that we are going to look at. Baker Mayfield coming in at 200, Javion Hawkins at 199, Phillip Lindsay 198, Ryan Suckup, kickers are people too, 197, Jared Goff 196, Marquez Valdez-Scantling 195, Jaylen Guyton 194, Henry Ruggs 193, Olamide Zaccheaus 192, AJ Green 191, Christian Kirk 190, Adam Humphries 189, Terrace Marshall Jr. 188, Hunter Renfrow 187, a defensive run at 186 and 185, the Patriots and Bills defensive teams respectively, Will Lutz 184, Matt Prater 183, Derek Carr 182, and 181, Tyler Bass. And Jamie, let's start with one of those names I just mentioned. You see his picture up there. Explain yourself. 182, for Derek Carr.
Look, he's a player that's had a very interesting conversation surrounding him in the fantasy community on social media. And the common narrative is that he overperforms his ADP on a yearly basis. That's not untrue, but I think their context matters in that scenario. And the context to that is, one, his ADP is always pretty low. And two, he's always healthy. Like on a per game basis, he was behind like some guys last year that were just non-factors. So to me, when I look at Derek Carr, I have him just under 17 fantasy points per game in my projection. The concern is going to be, This is a guy that hasn't had a real strong touchdown rate since the Amari Cooper, Michael Crabtree era of Raiders football. As I checked my notes here, 4.66% touchdown percentage. I think he's going to be more in that 25 in the last couple of years, more of a 25, 26 passing touchdown type player. There are going to be certain weeks where he's going to be ranked in the top 15 due to bye weeks or injuries and the right matchup. So he's going to be a player that's going to make some starts here and there throughout the season. But he comes in at my QB 23 right now. They're at number 182 overall. So in a 12-team league with that's not super flex, he's probably not going to be super relevant for you outside of bye weeks.
To use a phrase that we use in the TD and fantasy all the time, better real-life quarterback than he is fantasy quarterback when we look at some of the things that you need in a fantasy quarterback.
Just to keep filibustering for 1 second, Chris, I thought last year was arguably the best season from a pure football perspective Derek Carr had.
Yeah, and
but you have to separate that from fantasy.
Right, he was probably a top 8 real-life quarterback last season, but that doesn't necessarily...
Especially considering the weapons.
Yeah,
I mean, the non-Darren Waller weapons.
Right, and that doesn't necessarily translate over to being a productive fantasy quarterback. He comes in here as your quarterback 23 and 181 on the list. I want to talk about another guy that you saw highlighted there in the graphic. Let's talk about Phillip Lindsay, Jamie, and this is something that we've delved into a bunch on the podcast, trying to figure out what to make of certain situations around the league, and I think Phillip Lindsay's situation is one that we've gone back to a couple of times. We just got done doing the running back show and going through all of this. So Phillip Lindsay comes in here 198, just barely makes the top 200 for you.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by Phillip Lindsay as more of a handcuff that has some other potential value. Haven't projected out as my RB 55, a little under 7 fantasy points per game. I think he's going to get some work. I mean, I projected for him here about 40% of the rushing share there. So I do think he's going to get a decent amount of work. But, Culley's offense is a little bit of an unknown right now. David Johnson was relatively healthy last year. Who knows how long that's going to last? I don't think he's going to make it through a full season. But it's tough to see Phillip Lindsay making any sort of a weekly starting level impact for you while David Johnson is healthy. And quite frankly, we don't know how often Houston's going to be able to run the football just because they're not a very good football team. So I'm interested in him. Anybody that we talk about today is draftable. Like that's what puts them in the top 200 here. But coming in at RB 55 for me, he's somebody that is an end of the bench type option for you if you're just looking for flyers late in the draft.
All right, we talked about at the top of the show that we were going to have a special guest be joining us. Zach Cohen has picked out throughout the course of the night players that he wants to talk about. And I don't know these players. As we reveal the list, I then get told what player that we're going to Zach for. So I think the thing that is so enjoyable for me is I don't know when I throw to him if he's going to attack Jamie for just having a player rated too low, or if he's going to praise Jamie for having a player on the list. I'm hoping it's the
probably
former.
that one.
I hope it's the former, not the latter. But let's see. This is the first time we're bringing him in for the show, and the player that Zach wants to talk about is Jaylen Guyton. So, Zach, I'm going to pass it over to you here. Jaylen Guyton ranked 194th on Jamie's list. It's all yours.
Don't worry, guys. I won't just be praising everything Jamie does, but I got to start off with some love here because Jaylen Guyton's a true sleeper. I love that Jamie had him as a draftable guy. Would I have had him behind Hiron Johnson? Probably not, but he didn't show too much in his second season, but he was third in targets per game among the team's wide receivers. If he can hold on to his role of wide receiver 3, Guyton could way outplay his current value. And look, the Chargers' new offensive coordinator, Joe Lombardi, he loves to pass the ball. We know that. On top of that, this is an offense already built to run 3 receiver sets. They ran out of that formation more than all but 5 teams last season, which could mean Guyton sees the field, say, at least 70% of the time. There's clearly room for Guyton to make an impact, especially since LA could be among one of the top passing teams in the league. I'll take a flyer on Guyton, especially with the uncertainty surrounding Mike Williams. So we'll start off with a little praise there. I hope you agree with me, Jamie.
I do. I like whoever ends up being the Los Angeles Chargers wide receiver 3. I kind of stuck my claim in Tyron Johnson, who we'll talk about a little bit later, higher on this list. I just think he's a big play threat and has a chance to be really explosive. But whether it's Guyton, whether it's Johnson, whether it's Josh Palmer, there is a lot of value in whoever ends up being Los Angeles' wide receiver 3 this year in fantasy.
I'll tell you, we got through that first group, and I threw it to Zach for the Jaylen Guyton, and you could see the swag that Jamie had. He was feeling confident because Zach was giving him some praise. The shoulders were bouncing up and down. Yeah, he was feeling it. He was like, okay, we got one section out of the way, and yes, we're good, and we're feeling good here. So let's keep it moving. Players and please, folks, I have to do math here on
Chris
the show
doing math live on the air right now.
So just bear with me here.
Phenomenal.
I believe I'm about to read players 180 through 161. Does that sound good
That
to
does
everybody?
sound right.
Perfect. Can't
You're going to
wait.
mess this up at least once.
At least once, but so far 2 for 2. Let's see how far we can make it into the show. 180 Jason Sanders, 179 Harrison Butker, 178 Greg Zuerlein, 177 the 49ers defense, 176 the Dolphins defense, 175 the Colts defense. We talked about a defensive run earlier. There's a defensive run here. Darrell Henderson 174, Alexander Madison 173, Trey Lance 172, Tyrod Taylor 171, Kiki Kuti 170, Justin Tucker 169, Young Ho Koo 168, John Brown 167, Adam Trotman 166, Evan Ingram 165, Salvon Ahmed 164, Tony Pollard 163, Zach Wilson 162, and 161 Tua Tagovailoa. And Jamie, player number 168 on the list, Young Ho Koo, kicker 1 for Jaime Eisner.
He is. You got to get his name right, though, Chris. It's Young Wei.
Sorry.
Young Wei Koo, Christopher. Yeah, look, here's the thing, and here's why I wanted to specifically call Young Wei Koo out on this spot. He's my kicker 1 because, by the way, ever since he went to Atlanta, he's been the best fantasy kicker in football, period. Let me throw some stats at you. Last year, averaged 11.4 fantasy points per game to rank as the, drum roll please, Chris, number 1 kicker in fantasy. Oh, what happened about the 7 games he played in Atlanta the year before? You know what he averaged? About 10.7 fantasy points per game. Chris, do you know what that would have ranked?
Kicker 1.
It was the number 1 kicker in fantasy on a per game basis. He has been the number 1 kicker since being given the opportunity. And by the way, he scored almost 2.5 points per game more than my number 2 kicker, Justin Tucker, last season. So if you're going to take a kicker number 1, I understand Justin Tucker's got name value and Harrison Butker's got name value and Will Lutz has got name value. It's Young Wei Koo for me all the way as the top kicker.
Evan Ingram, the other player that I want to highlight here, Jamie, 165 for you. Listen, it's low,
Very
and I
low.
think you might be on a little bit of an island here in your stance about Evan Ingram. And I have to ask I'll ask the question this way: more of an indictment on Evan Ingram, or more an indictment of Daniel Jones is the quarterback, and I don't know what this Giants offense is going to look like in 2021?
It's a combination of 2 things. It is a slight indictment on Evan Ingram, who's not a terribly efficient player. It's more of an indictment on what his potential workload could be. You know, you look at what this offense was in New York last year. You didn't have Kenny Golladay, obviously. You really didn't have Saquon Barkley for the vast majority of the season. So you didn't have Kadarius Toney. You start to look at the way this offense is going to be set up, and the targets have to go somewhere. And you start look at Sterling Shepard. You look at Darius Slayton. You look at Kenny Golladay, Kadarius Toney, Saquon Barkley coming back. So if any of those guys are going to have similar workloads, or the workloads we expect for some of the new pieces there, or Barkley's going to go back to his workload, the targets have to be taken from somebody. And I think they're going to end up getting taken more, and probably the plurality of them will come from Evan Ingram last year. He had a 21.1% target share last year. That is pretty massive for a tight end, particularly one that is as inefficient and as, let's just say, hit or miss as Evan Ingram is. To me, this is more about indictment on his workload, because what I did with him is I took his catch percentage since he's been with Daniel Jones. I took his yards per target and touchdown rate since Daniel Jones, and I kept that all the same. The only thing I changed for him this year is I dropped his workload, and it pushed him all the way down here at tight end 19. Is it possible that the Giants deal with a bunch of injuries? Is it possible that somebody else severely underperforms in the Giants offense and Evan Ingram still continues to get a high volume of targets? Sure. But if I had to guess right now, I think with Kenny Golladay coming back and getting a ton of targets, with Saquon Barkley coming in and getting a ton of targets, Saquon Barkley coming back and getting a ton of targets, I think Evan Ingram is going to be the one that is the big loser of that group in New York.
Yeah, I think that group is going to be watched with a close eye from a fantasy manager perspective. Lots of question marks of Saquon, Kenny Golladay, Evan Ingram, Daniel Jones, all the names that you just mentioned. I think there are a lot of question marks of what that group can produce. Zach is back, and he wants to discuss, and I just love this. This just warms my heart. We got to get some defensive love in the show. Are you kidding me? The Colts defense. Zach, it's all yours.
Well, Listen, I'm always happy to talk about one of the most overlooked aspects in fantasy. Maybe I don't want to say I'm lying or cheating here, because I kind of want to talk about all the defenses you have in this range. And look, I know you guys brought me on to talk about, the nitty and the gritty with the teams and the players, and provide the hard-hitting analysis. I kind of did that for this one, because for as long as I can remember, I've streamed defenses and kickers. Unless it's the last 2 rounds, I just don't see why I should waste draft capital and a unit that I can easily replace each week. So to support my theory, I looked at my own championship-winning fantasy team from last season. In my 15-week season, I replaced my starting defense in all but 3 weeks, and I had one negative performance, but I digress. Even then, my defense is average 10.6 fantasy points. Last number one defense was the Rams, who finished with 9.9 fantasy points per game. This year you have the Colts defense. I think it's defense 7, right? Well, I like that ranking overall. That puts them, I believe, in the 15th round. That's fine, but I just had to point out that if you're taking defenses before the final 2 rounds, you might want to rethink your strategy. That's my strategy. Hopefully you guys agree with me on that.
Yeah, I do. And actually, Zach, you brought up an excellent point. Statistically speaking, and numerous studies have been done on this. Sounds so official.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we sounded so scholarly
if you read the latest workbook from Fantasy Football Weekly, that you are almost better off constantly streaming your matchups at defense and kicker, but particularly at defense over the course of the season, because Zach's anecdote right there of having the number 1 ranked defense on a weekly basis by streaming is actually fairly frequent. So if you're an active fantasy manager, you are way better off playing the matchups, assuming you're not in some weird league where like 2 defenses get drafted and you're really only dealing with like 5 or 6 defenses on waivers or something. More often than not, you use one of your last 2 picks on one of these defenses, but got to still rank them anyway. And we'll get into the next tier, which actually has top defenses.
Spoilers here. We'll get there. Okay. I got to read the list first, Jamie. Don't give it all away.
It's my list, Chris. I know it.
You know the list, but I don't. I'm reacting to it, in real time.
It's called a segue, Chris. I gave it to you. We're talking about defense here. Spoiler, this next tier, or it's not really tier, but this next group of 20 is going to have the top defenses, including the number 1 defense. Chris, we'll see how many words and names and players you have to read to get there.
I believe it's 160 through 141 is the next group of players that I'm going to read. Kirk Cousins leads us off at 160. Ryan Fitzpatrick, 159. The Ravens defense at 158. The Bucs defense at 157. The Washington defense at 156. The Steelers defense at 155. The Rams defense at 154. Matt Stafford, 153. 152 is Zach Moss. Wayne Gallman at 151. Javonte Williams at 150. A.J. Dillon at 149. Gus Edwards at 148, Zach Pascal at 147, Jamison Crowder 146, Justin Fields at 145, Tariq Cohen 144, James Robinson 143, Jalen Waddle 142, and 141 Elijah Moore. And Jamie, you teased it there. Let's talk about it. The Rams defense is your top defense. They come in here at 154 on this list. And I still think everything you said applies here, that you are probably going to be streaming a lot of these options. But what makes the Rams defense the top defense here for you this season?
Well, it's tough to kind of pick out the top defense overall because you're going to be wrong, because it happens every year. You think and you're going to be wrong. There's also a lot of turnover for some of those top defenses. The Ravens lost some key pass rushers. The Steelers lost some players as well. Even the Rams didn't go unscathed in the offseason. They're going to have a new defensive coordinator. So there are a lot more questions about some of these top defenses here. But I still absolutely love the talent that the Rams have. I love what their talent is for fantasy in particular, because you're looking for splash plays. You want sacks, you want turnovers. Like, that's what you're looking for. You don't care how many yards they give up in the process. You need splash plays, which is a big reason why teams like the Steelers, for example, have always ranked high. I'm going to have to lean toward them here. Because I feel like the losses that they suffered this offseason are a little bit less concerning to me, relatively speaking, and you're splitting hairs at the top here, than the losses for fantasy purposes that the Steelers and the Ravens both face. So I give them a slight nod here, but to me, I would be surprised if the Rams don't finish in the top 5 or 6, which is kind of what you're doing here when you're ranking the top defenses, is who has the best chance to finish in the top 5. It's also another reason why you should probably just stream the position if you can.
Absolutely warms my heart that we get to talk about this next player at 141, Elijah Moore.
Guy.
There, my guy from the New York Jets. And Jamie, you're a big fan of Elijah Moore. He comes in here at 141 for you this season. You do have some concerns about the way the Jets offense is going to look here in year 1, but Elijah Moore here, a player that we are focusing on in this grouping.
I kind of want to have him higher. I just having a hard time logically putting that into place. I can see all the hype. I know what the Twitter sphere has been talking about when it comes to Elijah Moore for the last 2 or 3 weeks now in particular.
That's right.
Comes in at wide receiver 66 for me. I look at him as, I think he can be a 5 target a game guy. Like, Chris, you're the Jets fan. Is that a reasonable expectation? Am I way off base on this?
No, I don't think so.
Is that
I
about
think,
right?
Yeah, that's about right. And I think the big question mark, and it's something that we've touched on, off air when you and I've had these conversations, is about, what the construction of this wide receiver group looks like on a regular basis. Jamison Crowder is back. That was something that we were kind of waiting on. And now it's how does Mike LaFleur deploy these guys on a regular basis? And what does that mean for Elijah Moore? Clearly, when you use a second round pick on a guy the way the Jets did, he is going to be utilized in this offense. You feel comfortable assuming a certain amount of targets for him.
Yeah. So figuring about 5 targets per game. And here's what I did for Elijah Moore as I checked my notes here. I looked at the rookie averages over the last 5 years for wide receivers that have 50 or more targets in their rookie season. And I said, if Elijah Moore just has the average catch rate, average yards per target, average touchdown rate, where would that pan out over 5 targets per game? Put him about 53 catches for 681 yards and 4 touchdowns. Like, I think that's doable. Puts him right there at a little bit over 8.5 fantasy points per game. Wide receiver 66, which puts him, as the high-end wide receiver 6, which is going to be somebody that's on your bench, somebody that you're going to work into your rotation potentially as a flex if you have a 2-flex league, especially during bye weeks. So I think he's going to be really, very relevant. If something happens to Corey Davis, for example, something happens to Jamison Crowder, he can obviously shoot up. But to me, there's still a lot of pieces in that Jets offense, and we really don't know how it's going to operate yet. So I don't want to buy the Elijah Moore hype train where he becomes a starter on your team coming out of fantasy drafts. But I absolutely love to have him somewhere in the middle of my bench.
Zach, stand by. I know the player that you want to talk about here in just a second, but I have to sidebar. Jamie, can you show the camera the stack of notes that you have? I'm just curious how big your notes page is.
It's not that big.
That's like, what was that, 4 pages?
Well,
are you front and back? Are you a front and back kind of guy?
No, I'm not front and back. They cost extra to do that. But the more important, and I'm cheap, but the more important part here is I want to make sure when I do the show, and the reason why you'll see me looking off here is I have very specific ways that I get to my projections, and I want to share them accurately. So I don't want to just memorize, because last year I tried to do this all off memory, and I went back and went, oh no, I explained this incorrectly. So apologies for my my camera etiquette here, but I want to make sure I'm getting the most accurate information possible to you.
In no way was I taking a shot at your camera etiquette. I just wanted you to show the viewers of this show the amount of prep work that goes in to you being able to do this, right? And so I thought maybe there was going to be like a stack of 20 pages that you were going to show me. It was like 4 or 5. The bit didn't really pay off the way that I wanted it to. This is where we bring Zach in to save us here and move this show along. It's player 160 for you on the board, Zach, that you would like to discuss. Kirk Cousins, quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, well, listen, guys. Listen, Jamie. I know you brought me on, hoping I'd give you the praise the entire show. I gotta grill into you a little bit here, and it's easy to see Kirk Cousins as your QB 18 and think it's a fine landing spot. I don't think anyone thinks he's a top 10 or even top 15 player at the position, and that's fine. I don't think much changes from last season over to this one when it comes to Cousins. And as you know, the best forecaster for future fantasy success can be past fantasy success if a player's situation remains generally the same. That's true for Cousins, who in 2020 averaged 19.1 fantasy points per game, the 12th most of the position. But guess what? Cousins was also the overall quarterback 6 in the final 9 weeks of the season. He was also a top 12 quarterback in all but 3 of the final 9 weeks, meaning you could have started him regularly. Yeah, Cousins doesn't have the upside of a Justin Herbert or the potential volume of a Joe Burrow, but he can still be a fine consolation prize later in drafts. I'd probably pick him ahead of where you have him.
I love it. We love to see the Jamie getting questioned. We love it.
This is an interesting argument, because to me I don't dislike Kirk Cousins. And once you start to get into that QB 18 above territory, you're starting to deal with guys that are going to start multiple games for you in a given season. I think the thing that puts him down here, particularly in drafts, for me, it's more like philosophy. So all of my quarterbacks are going to be lower on their ADP and overall than they would be normally, just because I don't draft quarterbacks early. But as far as ranks at the position, I just think it's the lack of upside for Kirk Cousins. Like, I know what I'm going to get from him. I think that grouping there that we'll talk about, but like from like QB 12 to QB 18 or whatever, they're fairly interchangeable on a weekly basis, and they're going to move up and around. And it is a good point where if you're going to wait on quarterback, you can wait a while and grab a couple of these guys if you have the bench space to do that. Kirk Cousins is going to be ranked as a QB1 for several weeks of the season. Like he was for me last year. He will again. We're just talking about on draft day potential upside. Like, guys are going to get hurt. Guys are going to miss time. And at the end of the year, Kirk Cousins is going to finish higher than the QB 18. I feel really confident saying that. But on draft day, I want to bank on some upside. I want to take a shot on one of these guys to be, that has a little bit higher level of a Matthew Stafford or Trevor Lawrence or, even a Matt Ryan, players like that. I just think have a little bit more upside on a weekly basis than what Kirk Cousins brings. But to your point, Zach, he is going to be a fine player for you. And as somebody that if you have him as your QB2 and you play the matchups with him and somebody else, particularly if you don't spend early capital on one of the top quarterbacks, you'll be perfectly happy.
We keep the line moving. The next grouping up, players 140 through 121. And see, Jamie, what you've done here is by you filibustering as long as you do, you allow me to do the math behind the scenes. So I can't fall into the trap of being wrong. So just keep that in mind. 140.
First time for everything.
There is a first time for everything. Darnell Mooney at 140, Tyrell Williams at 139, Rashad Higgins at 138, Mike Williams at 137, Alan Lazard 136, 135 is Jared Cook, Eric Ebron at 134, Trey Sermon at 133, Damien Harris at 132, Jamal Williams 131, Kenyon Drake 130, James Conner 129, Robert Tonyan 128, Latavius Murray 127, James White 126, Rob Gronkowski 125, Blake Jarwin 124, Austin Hooper 123, Emmanuel Sanders 122, and Nelson Aguilar at 121. And Jamie, feels like we do this every time we do a show together, you and I. Trey Sermon's name comes up and we discuss about it. So I will just pass it over to you and you can discuss why you have Trey Sermon down here at 133 and not higher like I think he should be.
Yeah, so Trey Sermon comes in 133, RB number 43 for me in fantasy. And let me just break down the math for you, Chris, because all my other explanations on the TDN Fantasy podcast has not quite worked out for you. Okay, the 49ers. Team he's on, right, Chris?
We're
agreeing so far. Okay,
we agree.
Averaged
yes,
24 rush attempts per game for running backs over the last 2 years.
Okay,
so if you look at that over a 17-game season and you add in some additional Trey Lance rushing attempts that I believe are coming, you're going to get about 388 running back rushing attempts projected for the Niners franchise next season. Okay. If you look at what Jeff Wilson, the number 2 back, their average, because I think at least to start the season, Trey Sermon is their number 2 back. Jeff Wilson is out for a significant period of time. Raheem Mostert is healthy, at least as we are recording this live right now. He is healthy. We'll see how long that lasts. But he was about a 10.12 carries per game guy over the last 2 years. So I'm assuming that Trey Sermon slides right into that spot where he is a 10 or 11 carry per game guy for the 49ers. He's not going to be heavily involved in the passing attack. That's not part of his game. And if you look at Kyle Shanahan's offenses over the last 2 years, they've averaged about 1.13 rushing touchdowns per game. So assuming he's going to get his share as the number 2 back there, I have him breaking it down to 172 carries for about 750 yards and 6 or 7 rushing touchdowns with only a little bit of passing upside. That gets you over 8 fantasy points per game. That gets you a solid bench player. That gets you a potential flex starter if and when something happens to Raheem Mostert. But he's still not the number 1 back there. He still has competition from Mostert, maybe Elijah Mitchell. He's going to have Jeff Wilson come back at some point in the season. Like, I don't think he's going to be the bell cow back there. So to me, at 10, 11, or even 12 carries per game, you're really getting a running back that's more of an RB3 low end at best than somebody that you're going to want to start most weeks.
And I'll very quickly articulate the only thing that I hang my hat on in coming to this argument, because I can't disagree with the math that you just presented and how you got to where you rank Trey Sermon here at 133. It's just Trey Sermon's skill set and game is so counter to everything that the 49ers have looked for and have used in a running back in recent seasons. And it makes me think that they might be looking for a guy to give a major workload to, and that guy could be Trey Sermon. It's a hunch. It's an assumption. It is a shot in the dark on my part to assume that Trey Sermon is going to really have a big workload. But that's what gets me to my conclusion, because when the draft pick was made, there was a lot of confusion of, Trey Sermon doesn't really fit the way San Francisco likes to run the ball. Why would they do this? Well, I'm trying to extrapolate that out. And again, we're in the business of predicting and guessing, and this is the guess I'm making.
It could be, but we also said the same thing. We scratched our heads with the Keshawn Vaughn drafting by Tampa Bay, and that was a
fair.
All involved.
That is absolutely 100%.
That's
fair.
the technical term.
Austin Hooper at 123.
Yes.
The other player that we want to talk about here.
Stop forgetting about Austin Hooper. I know it was a weird year for him, and I know there was like a lot of hype this time last year, and he didn't live up to it. But I went back and I looked at what he did last year, and I stripped away the ridiculous like monsoons that they played in for 3 straight weeks in Cleveland, and I tried to find a better gauge on what this offense looked like. To me, last year, he had almost an 18% target share in those non-rain games. Like, I think that would surprise people. He had a nearly 18% target share when healthy in those non-rain games. He had a 6.35% touchdown rate because Baker Mayfield just throws to tight ends in the end zone at a stupid rate. It is really hilarious to go look that up. No quarterback in the league throws a higher percentage of their touchdowns to tight ends. That's been a long-term starter than Baker Mayfield. So I like that together there. To me, I think this is a guy that's going to be between 50, 60 catches, over 500 yards, 5 or 6 touchdowns over the course of the season. Like, I think he's going to be in that little over 9.5 fantasy points per game. Doesn't quite put him in tight end 1 territory, but it puts him there at number 13 at the position right outside of it. I think people are sleeping on him a little bit. When he is active and healthy and the Browns are playing in at least normal human weather, he is going to be fantasy relevant. And I think people are completely off the Austin Hooper train going into this year.
We couldn't go through this whole tier without discussing another confusing running back situation, and that is the focus for Zach's player that he wants to mention here in this tier. It's Patriots running back Damien Harris, and good luck trying to figure out the Patriots running back situation, Zach.
I think I could do my best. And listen, as much as I love me some Trey Sermon this year, I will totally take the dice. I will totally roll the dice on Damien Harris. Jamie, you've been behind players like James Conner, Kenyon Drake, Jamal Williams, but I think Harris has a good chance to be the main running back in New England. And no, I'm not worried about James White. His role has decreased in recent years. As for Harris, he led the Patriots in touches per game last season, which does mean something coming into this year. And I know Bill Belichick doesn't love to show his cards. We never really know exactly what he's thinking until he actually does it. But it does say something that Damien Harris, among running backs, to see at least 24 touches, was first in touch rate per snap, ahead of every major running back, ahead of Zeke Elliott, ahead of Derrick Henry. And while this signals just a limited role, it does suggest that Harris, if he sees a few more snaps per game, his fantasy production would improve dramatically from his 9.1 scoring in PPR formats. Unless he gets outplayed by like Ramondre Stevenson, Harris is something no running back has in his current range, a good chance to be a featured back. I'd target him a bit earlier than where you have him.
Jamie, it's one of my fantasy rules in life. Don't draft New England Patriots running backs. It's my rule.
To me, it's look, I don't see anybody stealing a job from Damien Harris, but the question is are you going to get 17 games? You're going to get 14 games. You're going to get 10 games out of Damien Harris. And I think that's the question is going to be. He's dealt with injury since he's come into the league. You know, I believe he ended up only playing 10 games last year, 12 games in his 2-year career. That's the concern for me. So if you're going to take a flyer on Damien Harris, I'm all aboard that. Like, I think he's got the skill set. He's not losing. James White plays a different role. He's not losing his job to Sony Michel. He's not losing his job this year to Ramondre Stevenson. Like, he's going to be the guy when he's healthy. The concern is going to be how healthy is he going to be and how often the Patriots are going to run the football. So I'm perfectly cool with you taking a flyer on him. I just think he's somebody that he has a high bust potential as well. So I think that you have to kind of factor that in. But if you're looking late in your draft and kind of like looking to fill out your bench, maybe you're a little bit weak on running back and you have to take some more risks at the position, I'm perfectly okay with doing it. I just don't think you're going to might not get more than 75% of a season out of him.
One group away from the midway point here of the show as we close in on the top 100 players. We got one more group to go before that. Players 120 through 101. Michael Pittman Jr. starts us off. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown at 119. Michael Gallup at 118. Russell Gage at 117. Mecole Hardman at 116. Traquan Smith at 115. Tyron Johnson at 114. Dallas Goedert at 113. Tevin Coleman at 112. Devin Singletary 111. Jerry Jeudy 110. Irv Smith Jr. at 109, Logan Thomas at 108, Devontae Parker at 107, J.D. McKissick at 106, T.Y. Hilton at 105, DJ Chark at 104, Laviska Shenault at 103, Devonta Smith at 102, and Brandon Cooks at 101. And Jamie, the more Jets players that we can feature throughout the course of this show, the happier I'm going to be. Tell the people why they should like themselves some Tevin Coleman.
He's going to be the number 2 back there. R.I.P. LaMichael Pirine, who apparently can't even get on the field with the starters in minicamp right now. And look, Tevin Coleman's got his injury history, but he knows the offense. He's familiar with what Mike LaFleur wants to run there. And that's what I took a look back on. And I said, what happened last couple of years in that Shanahan, Mike LaFleur offense down there in San Francisco? Last 2 seasons, they averaged a little over 27 rush attempts per game. And the top 2 running backs got 22 of those carries. And I think we're going to see a fairly even carry split between Michael Carter and Tevin Coleman. I think Michael Carter is going to out-touch Coleman, but I think you're going to see a pretty even carry split between the two, which means you're looking at a spot where I think by the end of the year, if Tevin Coleman, even if he ends up playing 14 of the 17 games, could be flirting with 170, 180 total touches. And that's going to put him into this category where he's RB 36 for me, which puts him inside of the back part of single flex territory for 12-team leagues. You know, he might be a player that is difficult to start on a weekly basis because he might just give you that high floor when he's out there and really not give you much of a ceiling. But I do think he's going to get plenty of work. And it looks like Carter and Coleman is going to be the 1-2 punch in New York until one of them or both of them get hurt or not.
Jamie, I think one of the more intriguing things that people are going to take away from this top 200 list is where you have a lot of the rookies ranked here and what you think their production is going to be in their rookie season. Specifically, I think in the redraft format. Let's talk about Devonta Smith, who you have is rated player 102 on your list. I don't have your wide receiver rankings pulled up in front of me, so I don't know exactly where he ranks in terms of all the wide receivers, but does not crack the top 100 for Devonta Smith.
No, he comes in at wide receiver 46 for me. I have him just a hair over 11 fantasy points per game in full PPR, which, by the way, if we have not made clear, that is the scoring that we are using for this top 200 is full point PPR. And look, to me, I looked at what T.Y. Hilton's target share was in Sirianni's offense, for example. And it was about 18.63%, trying to figure out what the top target percentage could be in this Eagles offense, because it's going to be a completely different offense, new quarterback, new coach. Everything is different about this team. But putting that with them, you're probably going to get a little over 100 targets for Devonta Smith. And then at that point, I looked at rookies that have come into the league over the last 5 years that have gotten 100 or more targets. And what have they averaged? And putting their average, same things we talked about before, catch percentage, yards per target, touchdown percentage, probably puts Devonta Smith in about that 63 catches, 904 yards, 6 touchdown range, which is going to, again, he's going to be a starting caliber player on certain weeks. He's going to be in that flex consideration for you. Anybody that is even near that top 50 wide receivers, at least going to be considered for flex spots here and there. But you have to be a little bit concerned about the quarterback play, the complete dysfunction of this offense, what the staff's going to look like. So I have a little bit more questions about Devonta Smith having success in that Eagles offense in year one, just because he's not really in an advantageous situation to be extremely productive right away, even if he is supremely talented.
I'd like to take everybody behind the scenes for just a second here, because Jamie and I exchange a lot of different conversations about a lot of different fantasy players that we don't necessarily get to on the podcast, but we just exchange thoughts back and forth. And it brings me great joy that one of the players that we talked about this week is a player that Zach wants to feature right now during the show, because Jamie was pulling his hair out when discussing this player. Irv Smith Jr. is the guy for you, Zach, that you would like to discuss. So let's see if we can make Jamie pull a little bit more of that hair out.
Oh, man, I am so happy to get to contribute to this conversation because, Jamie, you have Irv Smith Jr. as your tight end 11. And while he certainly may have the talent to ascend that high, I need to pump the brakes just a little bit here. A couple of weeks ago, Mike Zimmer said Smith Jr. is not the Vikings tight end to be getting a bigger role, but rather it's Tyler Conklin, who's also pretty underrated as a pure talent. So let's say Conklin takes on Kyle Rudolph's role from 2020, which he did do in the final 4 weeks anyway. In that span, Conklin saw just one more target than Smith. Now, Smith did outscore Conklin in fantasy during that time, but targets provide a clearer picture of each player's involvement. Extrapolate their targets per game across a 16-game season, and both of them would have seen about 80 targets per game, which would have been in the top 14 at the position. While it's encouraging that Minnesota attempted their most passes since 2017, it's just not plausible for Smith and Conklin to each see at least 80 targets based on how this offense operates. I can't see Smith matching your projections as long as Conklin sees the field.
We love to see it. We absolutely love to see.
What did I say to you,
We
Chris?
make Jamie pull his hair out, but this is exactly in defense of Jamie. This is exactly the conversation we had this week.
I use language that I will not use on this show because we do not have a dump button for it. But I am coming down on Irv Smith a little bit. I want to get to training camp before I make any drastic moves, but I have noted Mike Zimmer's comments. The one thing that is going in Irv Smith Jr.'s favor is that he's a red zone monster. Him and Adam Thielen dominate in the red zone for the Vikings. So I do think you have a chance to have a 7, 8, maybe even 9 touchdown season from Irv Smith Jr., which will be enough to boost his value into that territory, even if his weekly production is going to be a little bit erratic.
Top 100. Here we go, guys. Halfway through the show, we keep it moving here. We get to the top 100. So 100 through 81.
Some big names coming up.
Big names coming up here for us to discuss, and it starts Gabriel Davis at 100, Sterling Shepard at 99, Cortland Sutton at 98, Raheem Mostert at 97, Ronald Jones at 96, Trevor Lawrence 95, Matt Ryan 94, Joe Burrow 93, Jalen Hurts 92, Justin Herbert 91. Do you sense a theme here, everybody? Aaron Rodgers at 90, Tyler Higbee at 89, Mike Gesicki at 88, Marquise Brown at 87, Odell Beckham Jr. at 86, Jarvis Landry at 85, Will Fuller, 84, Cole Beasley, 83, Noah Fant, 82, and Robbie Anderson at 81. And Jamie, I mentioned it, that there was a little bit of a run there on quarterbacks. Your player number 90 on the list, current Green Bay Packer, Aaron Rodgers.
For now, Green Bay Packer. Okay. Gather around, everybody. Gather around the fantasy campfire.
Get closer to your monitors where you're watching this, your phones. Get close.
Hello, friends.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about touchdown regression. Okay. So we have seen over the last few years the quarterbacks like Carson Wentz, like Lamar Jackson, like Patrick Mahomes, all who have led the league in touchdown percentage, saw a regression the following season. Aaron Rodgers had a 9.1% touchdown rate last year. He's not doing that again. Okay. It's not happening. All right. So I know I'm not factoring in that he's playing elsewhere or not going to sit out, whatever. At this point, I'm assuming he goes back to Green Bay. Everything's kumbaya, whatever, or close to kumbaya, and he goes and plays. He's not going to have a 9.1% touchdown rate next year. I have that dropping down to his 5-year average of 6.1%, which I think is very reasonable considering he hasn't even reached that mark in a couple of seasons before. If he has that, looking at the same amount of the way that Matt LaFleur has run that offense there in Green Bay the last 2 years, he's probably going to be closer to the 35 touchdown mark over a 17-game season than where he was last year. I still think he's going to be a guy that's only going to throw 4 or 5 interceptions, going to be over 4,300 yards. So he's still going to give you plenty of production, comes in at my QB9, nearing 20 fantasy points per game. But this happens in fantasy every year. We overrate touchdown rate for quarterbacks from the year prior. It always comes back down to earth. He's going to drop back down. And by the way, a 6.1% touchdown rate is not bad. That's really good as well. Again, you can never predict a 9% touchdown rate. Somebody's going to do it this year because it happens all the time. Somebody pops up and does it. You just really can't predict it. I don't think it's going to be Aaron Rodgers for the second year in a row because we have not seen that from even the elite of the elite, which Rodgers is.
For those of you potentially playing TDN Fantasy Bingo at home, this could be considered your free space, but if it's not, you're going to get a chance to check it off here. Jamie, let's talk about Odell Beckham Jr. for just a second.
Odell Beckham Jr. Okay, so here's the deal. Chris?
Yes, sir.
What year was it 5 years ago?
It was 2016, 5 years ago.
That's the last time the Odell Beckham Jr. everybody is drafting was actually the Odell Beckham Jr. everybody is drafting. All right, let's have an honest adult. Remember that conversation, those political campaigns way back when, having an adult conversation?
Oh, yes.
Let's have an adult conversation about Earl Beckham Jr., okay? This is a guy that's missed 25 games over the last 4 years. That's a lot. It's not great. He's going to a team that is run first and does not have a high volume of passing targets. Now, he's gotten exactly on the dot when he's been healthy, a 25% target share, which is nice. It's just 25% of a pretty low number. I have him projected to miss 4 games this year, which again, his average over the last 4 years is 6.25 games missed, but I only have him projected to miss 4 this year, keeping that same massive 25% target share. But over 13 games, that'll still get him a little over 100 targets. But he's got a 55% catch percentage, a less than 7.7 yards per target, and a 4% touchdown rate with Baker Mayfield. So you're looking at, in that stretch, a 55 catch, 775 yard, 4 touchdown season. Like that puts him at wide receiver 40 at just over 12 fantasy points per game for me. I don't see where this mythical upside is for Otto Beckham Jr. I hear about every offseason, this upset. He's not the player he was in New York. He's not getting the volume that he got from Eli Manning. He's not the same player. He's got an extended injury history. Like, yes, as from a talent perspective, is he elite? Sure. But from a productivity standpoint, particularly from a fantasy perspective, he's not anymore. If you can get wide receiver 3 production out of him, you should be happy. But people keep thinking there's this top 10 Otto Beckham Jr. upside. Not from the player that I've seen, and not in this Cleveland Browns offense. There isn't.
But Jamie, he made that really cool one-handed catch on Sunday Night Football.
Did he do that in Cleveland?
Did you factor that in?
Did Baker Mayfield throw him the ball?
I'm just curious. Was that factored into the numbers that he made that really cool one-handed catch on Sunday Night Football?
No.
Okay,
he's been better at throwing out money than he has been at catching passes. By the way, 55% catch percentage with Baker Mayfield is abysmal for somebody of both of those players' talent levels.
Yeah,
it's concerning for me. So if he gets out of Cleveland, he goes to a more pass-heavy offense at some point in the future, let's talk again. He did have a fairly healthy season a couple years ago in Cleveland, but this is not the same player. It's not the same situation that you were dealing with 5 years ago. And by the way, it was 5 years ago that you had that elite fantasy season. Like I'm starting to feel like we're having the Josh Gordon conversation all over again. Different circumstances, but like your memories really should not go back that far. If you have to go back that far to find the player that the quote unquote upside of the player, you have to wonder if that upside even exists anymore.
It's another receiver for Zach here that he would like to discuss. Cortland Sutton, a player that I'm really high on. He's number 98 on your list, Jamie. Zach, why is Cortland Sutton on your mind?
Listen, I promise I'll share some love as we get deeper into the rankings. This has been fantasy gold so far. Talking about Otto Beckham, I kind of almost forgot about him, to be honest. But one guy that a lot of people seem to forget is Cortland Sutton. He's just not getting talked about enough. Jamie, you have Sutton as your wide receiver 43, which is lower than his ADP of wide receiver 30. After missing last season with an ACL injury, we'll have to dip back into Sutton's production and usage from 2019 and see how Vic Fangio's offense operated. As expected, not much change in terms of passing tendencies and output, which bodes well for Sutton's projection. So in 2019, Sutton was far and away the Broncos' top receiver. But since then, Noah Fant and Jerry Jeudy have become viable options. So let's say that those two guys average 2 targets per game fewer than they did last season. And Sutton comes in and averages 6 targets per game, which even then, that's an extreme projection of devaluation for Sutton. He can still see north of 8 targets per game in 2021. Pair that with Sutton's talent, and I like him not just as Denver's wide receiver 1, but I like him as a top 30 receiver, regardless of who's throwing him the ball.
I get the talent coming off of an injury, terrible quarterback play, and he doesn't have that much chemistry with Drew Lock. He's only played, I believe, 5 games with him. And as you said, the emergence of Jerry Jeudy, the emergence of Noah Fant in that offense, it scares me a little bit. I love the talent, but I will buy into Cortland Sutton a little bit more next year, another year removed from the major injury, and likely with another quarterback throwing him the football.
Players 80 through 61 next up on our list. Chase Claypool starts us off. Kenny Golladay at 79. Corey Davis at 78. Curtis Samuel at 77. T. Higgins at 76. Julio Jones, 75. TJ Hawkinson, 74. Ryan Tannehill, 73. Kareem Hunt, 72. Naheem Hines, 71. Russell Wilson, 70. Leonard Fournette, 69. David Johnson, 68. Kyle Pitts, 67. Dak Prescott, 66. Tom Brady, 65. Deebo Samuel, 64. Brandon Ayuk, 63. Juju Smith-Schuster, 62. And 61, Marvin Jones. Mr. Eisner, the prosecution would like to ask a question.
I know what this is going to be about.
Julio Jones at number 75. Explain
I
yourself.
haven't pissed the internet off enough lately. Let's talk about this because I understand that seems low. And by the way, when I computed these numbers, I was like, wow, that seems low. The thing that's not being accounted for here in the Julio Jones conversation, in my estimation, that's going on right now is the severe volume difference in the way that the Atlanta Falcons offense has operated over the last handful of years and the way the Titans offense has operated since Ryan Tannehill took over. We are looking at, even in my projections, that I have the Titans projected to throw more this year than they have either the last 2 seasons. I have them getting over that 30 pass attempts per game mark, something they have not done in those last 2 years with Ryan Tannehill. The Falcons over the last 3 years have averaged about 10 more pass attempts per game than what I'm projecting for the Tennessee Titans this year. That is a massive, massive difference that's not being accounted for. I do not think Julio Jones is any less of a player than he was last year or 2 years ago. I am not saying that. I am not projecting any dip in his talent level. I am keeping the exact same in terms of his yards per target, his catch. I'm keeping all that stuff exactly the way it's been. I am not touching any of that, but he is going to see a lot fewer targets. I am factoring in a few missed games. That's why, to me, I look at like he received a 22% target share when healthy the last couple of years. I think he's going to be close to that even in this offense in Tennessee. You might be around 21%, but 21% of a Tennessee target share is a heck of a lot less than 22% of the Falcons' target share over the last few years. And I think that part's not being accounted for. That's where the difference comes in for me. You know, I think he's a little bit over a dozen points per game player. He comes in my wide receiver 30. I just think that the factor is of the way these offenses have operated the last few years is not being taken into account when it comes to the volume that Julio Jones is likely to receive in his first year with the Titans.
All right, Mr. Eisner, I accept your answer. Let's go to a player on the team that Julio Jones was just traded from, who comes in at number 67 on your list. I believe.
Bring Zach back in to do this with me. He's
got. I mean, the Florida Gator flag is up behind him. So there it is. There it is. It took a little bit, but he got there.
Gotta get the right over left, Jamie.
I don't know how this works. I don't know how this works.
I believe you're tight end 5.
I went to Arizona State. We probably shouldn't. I should mention that right now.
Okay, tight end 5 to keep us back on track.
All right. Kyle Pitts, tight end 5. Why is he a top 5 tight end, Chris? I'll tell you why he's a top 5 tight end. He's really freaking good.
Is that it? That's your analysis?
Yeah, no. So I looked at the way Arthur Smith operates his offenses, and the tight ends received about a 27% target share over the last 2 years in Tennessee. The top tight end got about 60% of that target share, giving a little bit of a boost to Kyle Pitts, just because I think he's going to be used in a little bit different way than a Jonnu Smith or even a Delaney Walker were used at times in Tennessee. I think he's going to be around that 18.5 target share percentage. And I do expect the Falcons to throw a little less this year than they have recently. Arthur Smith's offenses are more efficient than some of the other offenses that we have seen in Atlanta. But to me, the question is, can he be a 70% catch guy? Can he be an 8 yards per target guy? I think he can. And if you're going to do that and you put that over that sort of volume, you're going to get a 76 catch, 867 yards, 7 touchdowns. It's going to put him at a dozen fantasy points per game, which puts him right in the meat of that conversation, right outside of that very tippy top tier of tight ends that we all know about. I am more than happy to take Kyle Pitts, thinking he's going to be a top 5 tight end this year. And I've been saying that since the draft, and the numbers bear that out.
Jamie, you're a little down on Julio Jones because of the way the Titans offense is constructed. Well, for Zach, it's a conversation about Ryan Tannehill. So we will see here if he agrees with you about what to expect from the Titans offense.
Yeah, we kind of need to talk more about this Titans offense, specifically with Tannehill. And he's your QB8, and honestly, I don't hate it. I really don't. He's continuously been underrated in fantasy circles, but you have him ahead of Aaron Rodgers and Justin Herbert. And that's what I'm a little weary about. If you're looking for a consistent, solid QB1, Tannehill's fine. He can be your guy for that. Your rankings value him as an early 7th round pick in a 12-team league. But if I'm targeting a quarterback in that area, I want someone with top 5 upside. Tannehill doesn't really have that long term. What I mean by that is, can he be the highest scoring quarterback in a week or 2? Yeah, of course he can. He's done it before. But the top 5 quarterbacks in fantasy last season all threw for more than 500 passes. Tannehill was close, but he threw nearly 100 fewer passes than Herbert. Again, I don't want to overrate production from a previous season when projecting a future season, but a lot of times, like I said, future fantasy success can be forecasted by looking at past fantasy success. And essentially, this supports the idea that a top 5 quarterback should be the centerpiece of their offense. Allen, Mahomes, Murray, Watson, Rodgers, they were their offenses. Lamar Jackson in 2019 didn't hit the passing threshold, but he ran the ball at a historic rate. Even with the addition of Julio Jones, who, again, I agree with where you have Julio. Even then, you may be a bit higher on him than I am. It's hard to see Mike Vrabel leading an offense with 500 pass attempts for his first time ever. Rodgers and Herbert, they're the focal points of their offense. Tannehill isn't. Although, I'd still be perfectly fine with Tannehill as a quarterback 1.
Jamie, it was 50-50 there. It was 50-50. You got a little praise at the beginning, and then he was like, I disagree with you having Herbert and Rodgers behind him. So 50-50.
Here's the way I'll push it, because I think Zach has a point. And I think the point is the player that is most likely to finish in the top as a top 5 quarterback is not Ryan Tannehill.
Correct.
But the person that might be most likely to finish in the top 10 is Ryan Tannehill of that group. That's the way I would put that. They're all in the same tier. They're all pretty close to each other. But I do actually think the Titans throw more this year than they have before. Not a lot, but slightly more. But yes, the odds are that Aaron Rodgers, for example, has a better chance to say if one of these quarterbacks is finishing in the top 5. But I think Ryan Tannehill's floor is significantly higher than both those guys. Maybe not significantly, enough higher to put them ahead of them in these rankings, even though they're in the same tier.
The top 60. Here we are, 60 through 41 next up, and it starts with DJ Moore at 60, Antonio Brown at 59, Deontay Johnson at 58, Michael Carter at 57, Travis Etienne at 56, Mark Andrews 55, Tyler Boyd 54, Kyler Murray 52, Kyler Murray 53, Chase Edmonds 52, J.K. Dobbins 51, Jamar Chase 50, CeeDee Lamb 49, Robert Woods 48, Josh Jacobs 47, 47, Mike Davis, 46, Melvin Gordon, 45, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 44, Josh Allen, 43, Patrick Mahomes, 42, and at 41, it's Lamar Jackson. And Jamie, that's where I'd like to start the conversation.
QB1, baby.
Lamar Jackson, QB1.
So I went off script here with this, and let me explain why. Because I think Lamar Jackson might be getting slept on a bit. Last season, I know he had a terrible start. Again, terrible was like mid-level RB1, but terrible for where you drafted him. But he was the quarterback 2 from week 10 on last season, and he basically looked exactly like the quarterback he was before. He's got some other weapons around him, which is a big positive. You bring in Sammy Watkins, you bring in Rashad Bateman, you bring in Tylan Wallace. That's all fine and dandy. But I think the biggest thing that might be working in Lamar Jackson's favor is you're probably going to get a full 17-game season out of him. He missed one game each of the last 2 years for things that don't seem likely to repeat this year. 2 years ago, he sat out week 17 for rest because the Ravens were so good and there were 2 bye weeks that you didn't need to play the Ravens. He sat. He also missed a game on the COVID list last year. Neither one of those things seem repeatable for me. So you might actually get a full 17, or in this case, 16 for most leagues game season out of Lamar Jackson this year. Here's how I got to his number, because the reality is his pass attempts per game are all going to stay fairly consistent where they were before. He's probably only going to throw the ball about 26 times per game. His high touchdown rate, even him with his limited volume, is still a 7% touchdown rate, not a 9.1 like we talked about with Aaron Rodgers. But here's what I really like. I looked at his 2-year average for rush attempts per game, yards per attempt on the ground, and his touchdown percentage on the ground. I think if he just replicates that average, so I'm not asking him to be what he was 2 years ago. I'm just asking him to be somewhere in the middle there. We're looking at 187 rushing attempts for a career high 1,215 yards and 8 touchdowns. Like, that is a massive workload on the ground. That is more than 100 points difference in just rushing numbers than Patrick Mahomes, which is what ends up putting him over the top there for me. I think Lamar Jackson, with extended weapons, has a chance to even improve on some of his passing numbers that we haven't talked about. He's still going to run the ball around. Again, 11 times per game is what he averaged over the last couple of years. I think he can repeat that this year. Love Lamar Jackson. He's, to me, probably my favorite values of the top of the quarterback class right now.
Speaking of love, I don't know if there's a receiver you love more this season than Jamar Chase. You have him here 50 on our top 200 player list. We've had many conversations about him on the TDN Fantasy Podcast of how much of an impact we think he can be in year one. And you must think so as well. Here he is as a top 50 player.
Wide receiver 21, and I don't think I've ever been as in on a wide receiver as a rookie as I am on Jamar Chase. And I think this is actually, believe it or not, a fairly conservative projection. Let me explain why I say that, okay? I looked at what his potential target share could be in Cincinnati, a team that's going to throw the ball a ton. I think them and Dallas are going to be the ones that are leading the way in pass attempts this year. I just took A.J. Green's target share from last year, give him a 5% boost. So I'm basically saying he's going to be a 20% target share guy. Right, that alone puts him near 130 targets in this offense. And if, again, I just looked at now, the last 5 years, the average rookie that has gotten 100 targets. Now, again, that's a pretty darn good rookie because a lot of rookies don't get 100 targets in a season. But Jamar Chase deserves to be in that upper echelon. The average rookie in catch percentage, yards per target, touchdown percentage, if he just hits those averages for all rookies over the last half decade that have received 100 targets or more, we're talking an 81 catch, nearly 1,200 yard, 8 touchdown season. That puts him over 14 fantasy points per game. That makes him a wide receiver 2 right out of the gate. And by the way, leaves plenty of production for Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins to get in there as well. I think people forget A.J. Green was a huge part of this offense, was just woefully inefficient. Like, but Burrow and company targeted A.J. Green a ton. He just never came down with the ball. So we're not asking for more targets to be created in this offense to make Jamar Chase a superstar. We're just asking him to convert the ones that are already there.
Well, Jamie, I'm glad you mentioned the rest of that Cincinnati wide receiver room because it's Tyler Boyd who's on the mind of Zach. So, Zach, Tyler Boyd.
Jamie, you have Tyler Boyd as wide receiver 22. And I got to say, I love it. I love it. It's perfect. I continue to be surprised by Boyd's ADP. Forget the consistency he showed the last 3 seasons. With Burrow, Boyd was on pace to finish as wide receiver 13 while seeing the 11th most targets per game among all wide receivers. Without Burrow, Boyd finished as wide receiver 29, saw the 29th most targets per game. It wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. Jamar Chase may steal a target or two from Boyd, but Chase will mostly impact T. Higgins due to Boyd's role in the slot. If you're looking for a high floor receiver in the middle rounds, Boyd is your guy. So I think he's exactly where he should be in your rankings. Everything you just said about Jamar Chase applies to and with the terms of how that offense is going to operate. So I am all in on this Bengals offense and Tyler Boyd.
Very good, Jamie. You got one.
Tyler Boyd is underrated every year. He's the new Keenan Allen. Now that Keenan Allen's properly rated by most, it's now Tyler Boyd that continues to be underrated every year. He should not. By the way, T. Higgins is going to be really good too, but Tyler Boyd should not be ranked behind T. Higgins.
Two more groups to get through of 20 players, and then we have some final questions at the end that we want to get to, some of the players that we didn't necessarily touch on throughout the course of breaking down these top 200. It's Myles Gaskin starting us off at 40, Adam Thielen at 39, Cooper Kupp at 38, Michael Thomas at 37, Chris Godwin at 36, Chris Carson 35, David Montgomery 34, Tyler Lockett 33, Miles Sanders at 32, Allen Robinson 31, Amari Cooper 30, Najee Harris 29, Antonio Gibson 28, Nick Chubb 27, Darren Waller 26, Terry McLaurin 25, George Kittle 24, DK Metcalf at 23, Mike Evans 22, and Keenan Allen, just mentioned, he comes in at number 21. And Jamie, why don't we talk about where you have Michael Thomas on this list? Because he's here at player 37.
Number 37, wide receiver 16 for me. And look, he is one of the tougher players to rank. Just be perfectly honest with you, because we don't know what the New Orleans quarterback situation looks like. I'm assuming Jameis Winston's going to be the starter. So I tried to figure out what is a reasonable target share, because a big reason why Michael Thomas, to the one point where he was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy for a couple of years, was he received an absolute stupid amount of targets, and they were all high volume, high probability or high catch probability targets. Okay. So I looked back to when Jameis Winston's last 2 years as a starter in Tampa Bay, and he had a star receiver there as well in Mike Evans. The top target share for the receivers in both those years combined was about 22%. I thought that was still a little low for what Michael Thomas can be, because he was up over 31% with Drew Brees as his quarterback. So I kind of settled into like the mid 25%, a little bit 25.5%, which still puts him in a pretty solid range. I gave him I looked at his 3-year catch percentage and his yards per target and career touchdown percentage, which I think is nice considering that he's still getting a downgraded quarterback, but I didn't want to drop him too far. That puts him in that 104 catch, 1,200 yards, 6 or 7 touchdown range. That's a damn good season. It's just not a wide receiver 1 season. He comes in as my wide receiver 16. He's going to be between 15 and 16 fantasy points per game. I imagine he's going to have some big weeks, but I don't think he's going to be this target monster that he was in the prime, just because I don't think the offense is going to be set up in that way. I don't think Jameis Winston is a guy that's going to lock in on his number 1 target the way that Drew Brees locked in. I think Jameis Winston is going to take a lot more risks, a lot more chances down the field that are not exactly Michael Thomas's game. So I still think he's going to be, again, 100 catch, 1,200 yard receiver. I still think he's going to be damn good, but I don't think he's going to be the player that was fighting for wide receiver 1 overall a few years ago.
Jamie, it's been a theme in each of the last couple of groups of players that we've talked about. A rookie has been mentioned just because of how high they find themselves on your list of top 200 players for the 2021 season. And I don't know if there's one that you could talk about more highly than Najee Harris here at 29. You are super in on what Najee Harris can be in this Pittsburgh Steelers offense.
Yeah, I love the volume he's going to get. He's my highest ranked rookie here at number 29, comes at number 15 among running backs. Again, trying to figure out what a potential workload could look like. You know, over the last 3 seasons, Mike Tomlin's teams have averaged 23.19 rush attempts per game. And if he's used just the way James Conner was in that stretch, we're talking about a 60% share of those carries for him. Looking at a 4.2 or even 4.3 yards per carry, which I think he's a more talented player than that, but might struggle behind that offensive line and might have to deal with all of that, puts him still over 1,000 yards. Tomlin's offenses over the last 3 years would average about 2/3 of a rushing touchdown per game, which means they should be around 10 rushing touchdowns this year. I imagine that Najee Harris is going to get the vast majority of those. I have him down for 8. I expect that, we looked at running backs for Tomlin have averaged around 110 targets a season, with his top running back getting nearly 2/3 of that. So Najee Harris can be a 70 target guy. He's going to get involved in the passing game. I love everything about what he's going to be able to do this year. I think he's going to be north of 15 fantasy points per game. There are going to be some weeks where he's an RB1, but I think by the end of the year, he's going to be in that upper end RB2 category. He's just going to have more than enough volume to get the job done.
It's another running back for Zach. So you talked about Najee Harris. Zach wants to talk about Myles Gaskin.
Yeah, Jamie, I loved where you have Boyd, and I really liked where you had Myles Gaskin, too. He averaged 16.4 points per game in PPR formats last season, 11th most among running backs to play at least 6 games. Take that, extrapolate that past 10 games, the 10 games he played in, and he would have finished as an RB1. For this season, let's say Gaskin averages 17 carries a game, just like he did in the 7 games he started last season. Assuming he's still on par with his production, Gaskin could be earning at least a point per carry. Obviously, it's expected that no player replicates his stats from a prior season, but in this case, that would place Gaskin as a firm RB1, meaning he would be among the top 12 running backs in your league. And there aren't any reasons to suggest Gaskin can't be that 17 carry guy again in 2021. I like where you have him, and I'd even consider him over Miles Sanders and David Montgomery.
It's 2 in a row, Jamie. I don't know if I like the way.
Look, I want to put Gaskin higher. If you guarantee me I'm getting 17 games of Myles Gaskin, he's going to touch RB1 territory. Like, I mean, it's as simple as that. I just don't think you're going to get it. And I think it's more of just an injury risk. I don't think between Malcolm Brown and Salvin Ahmed and some of the other pieces they have there, I don't think any of them are going to really steal Myles Gaskin or Jared Dokes. I think they're going to steal Myles Gaskin's touches. The question is, can Gaskin stay on the field with that sort of workload for 17 games? I don't think he will. But when he plays, he's going to be a borderline, if not already in RB1 territory.
We've gotten through 180 players. Here we are, the final 20, the top 20 on Jamie's list for the 2021 fantasy season. Deandre Swift starts us off at number 20, Justin Jefferson at 19, DeAndre Hopkins at 18, Cam Akers at 17, A.J. Brown at 16, Tyreek Hill at 15, Joe Mixon 14, Calvin Ridley 13, Stephon Diggs 12, Austin Eckler 11, Saquon Barkley 10, Travis Kelce 9, Ezekiel Elliott 8, Devontae Adams 7, Alvin Kamara 6, Aaron Jones 5, Derrick Henry 4, Jonathan Taylor 3, Dalvin Cook 2, and the number 1 player on Jamie's big board, top 200 for the 2021 fantasy season, Christian McCaffrey tops his list. Listen, TD and fantasy bingo players, I told you that you might get another free space a little bit later on. I know
this is going to be. All right, Chris, let's talk about this because this one's near and dear to your heart. I know what this is going to be.
DeAndre Swift at number 20. I think this is a little aggressive on your part, but I think your numbers are going to maybe persuade me.
So I'm going to pull back the handy dandy notebook here again because I got a lot of numbers here because I really need to sell Chris on this because he has been trying to sell DeAndre Swift in his keeper league for 3 months now?
He's gone now. I got rid of him.
He's already gone.
I'm out.
So you've successfully done it. So I have Swift comes in at RB12 for me, just sneaks into the very, very bottom portion of RB1 territory. And the reason why is I looked at the way Anthony Lynn has operated his offense the last couple of years. Obviously, there's a new regime in Detroit this year. Lynn has averaged about 22.84 rush attempts per game to running backs over the last 2 years, with his lead back receiving a little over 55% of that share. So just, again, 55% of the share gives me a DeAndre Swift projection of about 215 carries. Okay. Leaves plenty of carries for Jamal Williams, plenty of role for him to be that player that they used as a complement to Austin Eckler, for example, when Lynn was in Los Angeles. From week 8 on last season, Swift averaged 4.31 yards per carry, which will kind of get him down to that workload to about 925 yards. But to me, this is where the biggest thing comes into the equation. And by the way, this is, Swift should be in that 6 or 7 touchdown range on the ground, but it's the passing game that's really going to boost Swift's values. Running backs averaged almost 11 targets per game with Anthony Lynn's offenses over the last 2 years, but Goff hasn't been a big check down guy to running backs. He's only averaged about 4.5 per game. So I kind of split the difference between the two because I imagine Goff's going to be dumping it off a little bit more, particularly with the lack of weapons on the outside in Detroit. So I think we're looking at more of about 8.5 running back targets per game for everybody that's a running back in that offense. And the lead back got about 60% of that. And I think that's what DeAndre Swift will get. All in all, I think this is going to be a guy that's going to be in that 85 to 90 target range, around 75 catches, can be around that 1,500 total yards and 10 total touchdowns if he stays healthy over the course of a full season. I am perfectly fine with DeAndre Swift going as an RB1. I am perfectly fine going with him in the top 20. Jamal Williams is going to get enough work on his own. I don't care if they sign Todd Gurley. I don't care if they sign Adrian Peterson. I don't care if they sign Bo Jackson. I don't care if they sign. I don't care.
Wait a minute.
Don't care who they sign.
If they sign the last guy in his prime, I would be a little concerned.
Well, if they figure out how to do that, then we'll see.
Yeah,
I don't care if they sign Calvin Johnson. I don't care who they sign and turn him into running back. I don't care. DeAndre Swift will be fine. He didn't have a huge volume of snaps last year either, and was still incredibly productive, even more productive than guys like Antonio Gibson, for example. I'm not expecting, look, if DeAndre Swift had truly had this backfield to himself, he's a top 10 back. He's a top 8 back, but he doesn't have that. That's factored into this equation.
Yeah, I don't think it's factored in enough, Jamie.
I think it's factored in plenty, Chris.
You
think he's going to get less than 55% of the carries share? These get less than 60% of the targets to running backs?
My concern, and I will very quickly outline it here because there's more players to discuss, but I have concern about Jamal Williams' role. I understand that your math, it gives Jamal Williams a role. I still think that role is going to be bigger, and it is going to cut into what DeAndre Swift is going to be able to do. And if you look at the snap counts that DeAndre Swift got last year, it wasn't a lot. He got a little bit of a run late in the season where he got a decent workload, but I have concerns about him having a good enough workload over the course of a 17-game season. So this will be one of the fun things to follow throughout the year of who is right on
Chris
this.
And I yell about this.
Is Jamie right or am I right? And Jamie, you're going out on a limb here, and you have Jonathan Taylor, player 3 and RB3. Very quickly here. I am in 100% agreement with you on this. You know how I feel about Jonathan Taylor. We've discussed this behind the scenes before you made this decision, and I threw my vote of support behind this decision. But a lot of people are going to see this Jonathan Taylor as your 3rd overall player.
Well, to start with, the race for RB3 is as open as ever, because I think Alvin Kamara has some concerns given that it's going to be a different offense. What is his target share going to look like with Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill as compared to Drew Brees? Derrick Henry is going to be an offense that's probably going to throw a little bit more than they're used to, might not be able to run it as effectively with some of the defensive issues that they have there. Aaron Jones might not have Aaron Rodgers. So this race for RB3, and by the way, Zeke and Saquon are not in the same categories they were before when they were 1 or 2 years ago. So those typical like guys that have been hanging around that RB3 territory over the last few seasons just aren't there anymore. So it is an open race here. And I'm giving it to Jonathan Taylor, a guy that averaged 20 carries per game from week 11 on, including the postseason. They leaned on him very heavily. They will lean on him heavily again. Nyheim Hines had a role last year, had a whole role late last year, and will continue to have a role going into next year. I do not think Marlon Mack is a threat to steal touches unless Jonathan Taylor gets hurt. I'm really excited about what he can do this year. Last year, averaged nearly 5 yards a carry and a nearly 5% touchdown rate. Like, he's going to be leaned on heavily this season. I think he has the stuff to finish as a top 5 running back, a top 3 running back, and as a number 3 overall player, as I tend to go RB heavy in the opening round of fantasy drafts.
We go to Zach Cohen for the final time tonight as he talks about the last player on his list that he wants to. I don't know. It's been a bit of a love affair with Jamie over the last couple of rounds where he's been heaping praise off of some of the players that Jamie has ranked. It's A.J. Brown, the last player that he wants to discuss, player number 16. So, Zach, are we going to close on a good note for Jamie?
I think I gave him enough praise in the last 2 turns. Let's end on something that just kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit in A.J. Brown. Listen, no one's denying he's a young star on the rise, especially in fantasy. In case you didn't know, though, Julio Jones is a Tennessee Titan. While I don't expect him to return to his elite form, I do expect Jones to limit Brown's ceiling just a bit. We can really use the benchmark set by Corey Davis last year as a clue to how Brown will fare this season. Brown averaged 7.6 targets per game, while Davis averaged 6.8. Let's assume that Jones slides into Davis's role, and signs indicate that's what's going to happen. Now, the top 5 receivers in 2020 last year were all in the top 6 of targets per game, excluding Tyreek Hill, who was 8th with 9 targets a game, I believe. So for Brown to reach Hill's threshold, the Titans would need to pass, say, 2 to 3 times more per game, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that would mean they're throwing the ball more than 32 times per game. That's never happened in a Mike Vrabel offense, even with Tannehill at quarterback. Look, Brown's a top 10 fantasy receiver, hands down, no questions asked. I just don't think I'll see enough volume to warrant a top 5 selection at the position. That's my final thoughts on this. If you had asked me to give thoughts on all 200 players and teams, I'll do it in a heartbeat, but I don't think anyone wants to sit at their computer for that long.
I appreciate there, Zach. I have not seen really anybody push back on A.J. Brown as a fantasy player in 2021, so it was interesting to have your take there. Jamie, you looked like you wanted to respond in some way there.
Look, the volume is a factor you have to consider, but on a per-target basis, A.J. Brown might be the best fantasy player on a per-target basis. Now, that's not how this game is played. But he's somebody I do expect the Titans to throw a little bit more this year, not near 32 points, I think, or 32 times per game. I think they're going to ever so slightly get over 30 this year for the first time in a while. But I think he's going to be able to be incredibly productive. But the Julio Jones thing did drop him for me. Like, he moved down a couple spots. He was going to be my wide receiver 3 before the Julio Jones trade.
Jamie, we are going to wrap up with one outstanding question from each position group, whether it's a player that you want to highlight or it's a player that we didn't mention at a position that I can just hear social media abuzz looking for you to answer for yourself. And I feel like we have to start with running back, and we will complete the TDN fantasy bingo here. So you can collect your prize because you now have won, because I know this is on the fantasy bingo card. Saquon Barkley is your 10th overall player.
Yes.
And it's not even really a question. I am just going to open the floor up to you to answer the criticism that I know has gone your way for you being so down on Saquon Barkley this season. Again, I just want to remind everybody, you have Saquon Barkley as a top 10 fantasy player in your preseason rankings. But with that being said, you are still lower than him for most people.
The thing I don't understand is why, after back-to-back years with significant multi-week injuries, the multi-week ankle injury 2 years ago and the season-long ACL injury last year, why, after 2 consecutive years of that, why people are drafting Saquon Barkley at full price as if he was fully healthy both years. Like, drafting him as the RB3, which is where he's going in many fantasy leagues right now, is ludicrous to me. You are buying him at his absolute peak when there's really no reason you should. Now, a study by Fantasy Labs a couple years ago found out that since 1999, fantasy running backs in the year coming off of ACL surgery saw a dip in their production down to only about 2/3 of their pre-ACL injury selves. Now, I don't think that's going to happen with Saquon because he's a freak, but I do think we're going to see a dip. The other thing that people are not accounting for, it was a big thing that I was pounding the table for last year, is that he doesn't get the same sort of target volume or target share with Daniel Jones that he got with Eli Manning. And that's not being considered. He doesn't have 90-95 target upside or 90-90 catch upside anymore. That's not there in the way that Daniel Jones has operated this offense in New York. So I looked at what he did last year. I looked at how the running back situation in New York played out, where they got 81% of the total carries, about 25 carries per game went to running backs last year. And I expect Barkley to get about 88, 89% of that share when he's healthy. But to me is you're looking at a guy that's probably not going to be at 4.5 yards a carry this year. You might get back there next year, but might be slightly lower than that. You're looking at probably about a 3% touchdown rate. But to me, I'm looking at a guy where I do have him missing a couple games just to account for the fact that, again, he's missed significant time each of the last 2 years, that you're probably getting a guy that's going to be 1,100 yards, 7-8 touchdowns, probably closer to 70 targets. Have him missing a few games in there. That's not a 17-game projection, but I just don't see him as being this same player that people want him to be. And maybe he gets there next year. Maybe he gets there on a per touch basis at some point, but I don't understand paying 100% full value for Saquon Barkley as if he has been dominant the last 2 years when he hasn't been because he's missed so much time.
I want to give you an opportunity to talk about a player at the wide receiver position that is somewhat of a sleeper for you. It's somebody that you are a big fan of for this season, and that's Marvin Jones, who you have as player number 61 overall. And you have heaped a ton of praise on what you think the value is for this player, and you are super high on him for this season. So Marvin Jones to close us out at the wide receiver position.
My wide receiver 26. So I've gone full galaxy brain on Marvin Jones here. To me, I look at who's going to be the number one receiver in Jacksonville, a team that's going to throw the ball a ton. And I look at the offensive coordinator and the play caller there in Dell Bevel. And oh, by the way, who does he have a relationship with? Marvin Jones. It's Marvin Jones from his time in Detroit. What did he do with this Marvin Jones-Dale Bevel combination in Detroit, which, by the way, included a lot of games with Kenny Galladay? There ain't no Kenny Galladay player in Jacksonville right now to take these targets away. Received a 19.7% target share in his 29 games played. So if he gets a similar target share from Trevor Lawrence, we're talking nearly 120 targets from Marvin Jones, who's been really, really solid when he's gotten the opportunity. Just looking at his 3-year catch percentage, yards per target, and touchdown percentage with that sort of workload, that's a 77 catch, 1,000-yard, 10 touchdown season. Like, I think you're going to get somebody that is going to be a red zone threat for the Jaguars. He's going to be the number one receiver for the Jaguars. That's my big galaxy brain moment there. I like Laviska Shenault a lot. I like DJ Chark a little bit less. But I think Marvin Jones is going to end up being the veteran presence there. He's going to be the guy that leads the Jags in receiving touchdowns and is going to be a guy that Darrell Bevell is designing specific plays for and a veteran that Trevor Lawrence can lean on heavily during the season.
Jamie, do me a favor. I want you to scroll all the way down to player number 92 on your board.
Okay, Chris. I'll open the floor to you here because you and I have been screaming about this for 3 months.
You have Jalen Hurts as player number 92
QB11.
on your board. QB 11, meaning you have him as a QB 1. And I guess my question to you is what confidence you have in his abilities as a passer, because you have outlined to me the upside in terms of rushing potential. And we know that how important that is in terms of being a worthwhile fantasy quarterback option. It's why Lamar Jackson is your QB1. A big part of that is because of his ability to run the football.
Huge part of that.
Lamar can also throw the football. I don't have the same kind of confidence in Jalen Hurts' ability to throw the football. So how do you get to Jalen Hurts as QB 11 and a top 100 player?
Well, he is going to be that as long as he starts. And I think the question here is, do you believe he is the starter for the full season in Philadelphia? Because if he is, he's going to be higher than this. He's a top 10 quarterback in the games that he's going to play. Here's why. Look, he's not a great passer. Like, there's no reason to believe he's going to be amazing. And by the way, my passing numbers for him are not all that exciting. Over 17 games, 3,900 yards, 21 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. That's not exciting. But what is exciting is his potential to run the football. The average rushing attempts last year of the top 6 quarterbacks in the league is 7.5 rush attempts per game, which was less than what Jalen Hurts was rushing in his 4-game sample size last year. But even if he does that at his 5.91 yards per carry average, he's going to be above 750 rushing yards, probably get you in the end zone 7 or 8 times. That is huge value, and that's really what's going to buoy it for him. The thing that's going to derail Jalen Hurts from a fantasy perspective is Jalen Hurts, the real-life quarterback. So I understand why that is a concern for you, Chris. And I understand why you're smirking.
Thank you.
But you know what? I've won a fantasy championship with Tim Tebow. Okay. And I still think Jalen Hurts is better than Joe Flacco.
You have said this before. This has been one of your go-to lines of I've won a fantasy championship with Tim Tebow. Did you have Tim Tebow ranked as your quarterback 11? I
wasn't doing rankings then, Chris.
Okay, let me help you out here. If you were,
I don't think he began the season as a starter, so no, I didn't.
Right.
But
So
Jalen Hurts is beginning the season as a starter.
Okay, but your big argument with me is that I've won a championship with Tim Tebow. Tim Tebow wasn't going to be rated as
Chris,
your quarterback.
If Jalen Hurts starts a 17 games, okay, Chris. If I say I guarantee you Jalen Hurts doesn't lose his job. I don't change anything about what his performance, but doesn't lose his job. Where are you taking Jalen Hurts?
I'm not taking Jalen Hurts as a QB1. I'm probably
even with 17 guaranteed games. I think that's ludicrous. He's a top 6 quarterback if he played 17 guaranteed games.
Are we going to close the top 200 reveal show with a TD and fantasy friendly wager? Is that how we're doing this?
No, because we have one more name to go over. But yes, we can make one. Do we not have a Jalen Hurts wager?
We might. I'd have to go back.
We probably do. You have to check the board.
I have to check the board.
No,
here.
but we're going to do another fireside chat with this next guy that we're going to end the show with.
Robert Tonyan. Player 128.
Back around. So let's talk about touchdown regression again. Chris, if you had to venture a guess, I'm totally springing this upon you now. What do you think Robert Tonyan's touchdown rate was last year?
Was it 6%?
No. It was a little higher than that. You want to take another guess?
Is it like 9%?
18.64%, Chris.
I will take the under on that for next season.
Not happening. The 3-year touchdown percentage average of the top 10 tight ends in total touchdown percentage. So the best of the best in touchdown percentage. The average over 3 years, 6.77%.
So my first answer was right on the money of what it should be.
The touchdown regression is coming, and it's coming hard. Okay. 5 touchdowns is kind of what I have him at this year. I think he can replicate his catch percentage, which was, by the way, really high, a little bit over 82%. I think he can be a 9 yards per target guy. I think he can do a lot of the same things he did last year, but he's not catching 11 touchdowns. Like, he's not catching 11. You can clip this out. I'm ready for the roast of Jamie next year. He's not catching 11 touchdowns. From Aaron Rodgers, from Jordan Love, from Brett Favre, from Bart Starr. He's not catching 11 touchdowns next year.
I can't wait for him to catch like 12 and
or like 3 on opening night or something.
See, I was right. He
3 in week 1.
Wasn't going to catch 11. Okay,
that's my argument with Robert Tonyan. He's down at tight end 16 for me, 8.4 fantasy points per game. If you have his touchdown total, this is a little bit more than having it, he's just not the same fantasy tight end. Like, that's the thing. You're paying for the touchdown production of last year, which, again, I will remind you, was nearly 3 times higher than the 3-year average of the top tight ends in the NFL. Not happening.
On that note, we're done here. 200 players read to you, revealed Jamie's top 200 fantasy players for the 2021 season. Some conversations about some of the ones that we thought were more notable. But if you want to see all of the rankings and the projections that Jamie has done, all of those numbers that he read off of that big stack of paper that he showed off earlier in the show, that stuff is over at thedraftnetwork.com. It is all up on the site for you to consume. So if you want to take this information that Jamie's put together, tailor it to your league to be able to have this kind of information when you're drafting in the next couple of weeks and months. It is all at your disposal over at thedraftnetwork.com. And yes, this was a top 200 player reveal show, but there is more fantasy content coming your way over at thedraftnetwork.com with the TDN Fantasy Podcast. So we will continue to have you covered all throughout the fantasy offseason and up until the regular season begins, and then obviously throughout the course of the 2021 NFL season. Gentlemen, it has been a blast doing this show with you. We went a little bit over. The producers are in my ears for the last 35 minutes yelling at me to get us out of here, but I said no. We had to get to all of these players and have all of these discussions. So thanks to all of you out there who joined us for this big reveal show. Hope you guys had a good time. We certainly did. For Zach Cohen, for Jaime Eisner, I'm Chris Schubert. Have a good night.